Nobody goes into a movie and truly believes that Spider-Man is now dust. They know it's a fiction. SpongeBob routine begins, as I said, with the purse frame, saying that it's my wife's purse. And then I would open it up and I would pull out the first sponge ball or two. I immediately pick up one of them. I say, well, they're clown noses. As you know, magicians and clowns are mortal enemies. Whenever a clown and a magician meet in real life, we battle to the death. And when the magician wins, he chops off the clown's nose and he keeps it as a trophy. So now we've got a premise that introduces the clown nose, yet severs it from the notion of the fake clown nose, because in this context, I'm treating clowns as if they are real, and I've chopped off the entirety of their nose, not just the fake nose that goes on their face. So I've now introduced a quirky premise that creates a fiction that I don't have to explain is a fiction. I don't like necessarily buying too much into overly fantastical presentations, but quirky presentations that are clearly not objective reality, I like, because I take issue with the notion of lying to your audience. I have no problem with lying to them with their consent, which entertainment generally does. Movies do all the time. Nobody goes into a movie and truly believes that Spider-Man is now dust. They know it's a fiction. With magic, most people tend to know that it is a fiction, but there are unscrupulous people who take advantage of the fact that you can use these deceptions for less than scrupulous means. And so I think that because there is that existence, and because people we know are still easily deceived by the same techniques in a malicious way that we use, I think that we have a certain moral obligation to not mislead our audiences in any way about the world. I have no problem with misleading them based on their assumptions within the context of the trick, but at the end of the routine or at the end of the performance, your audience should not walk away believing or even potentially believing something about the world that you know to not be true. So while I can play with the premise of maybe my shadow is being used to affect reality, like by moving a haunted deck, I want to frame that in a context that in the end, they don't walk away thinking that's an actual possibility, that I actually have the ability, or that somebody could train to have the ability to affect something with their shadow. I don't think that that is an ethical thing to do. I think sending people out with that idea in their mind is not only a violation of their trust as a human being, but especially as a performer. I also don't think that we should be spoon-feeding our audience, and I also fully acknowledge that there are people that you will never be able to convince one way or the other. Penn and Teller famously used to do seances in the Houdini vein where they would then say that it's all fake, and they would tip even some of the methods, but afterwards they would still have people come up to them and say, look, I know you have to say that it's fake, but my grandmother died, and can you tell me what, and it's heartbreaking to be in that position. But it's also the unfortunate reality is that there are people who will project and infer their own beliefs and misunderstandings of the world onto our magic. All I feel is that we should not do anything that we know could encourage that. But again, that's why the context of your premise, or the context of the show, context in general, context is always important. If somebody convinces somebody that they've been hypnotized into not being able to see certain things, or they've been convinced that they're now invisible.
Here goes nothing.
Okay, hold on 1 second.
In the context of a magic show, that's fantastic. In this context, they understand that, okay, this is a trick, but in the context of I'm going to play a prank on somebody at home, and they actually believe this is 100% real, and my family can't see me now, well, now you suddenly crossed into a different area, and it starts to be cruel. Which is why you always have to be able to read the room, and you all know what I'm talking about. It became a viral sensation, turning somebody invisible, which I thought was great, and could be a great, fun prank to play on somebody. But the moment that a child is having a meltdown over it, and you keep pushing because you know you still have to get the picture that you've already staged, otherwise it doesn't count. The kid's in tears, and you're still pushing this fiction about reality that they believe it with all their heart in that moment. It's not that they believe it within the fiction of the game we're playing. It's they believe that their family can no longer see them. And at that point, that's when it becomes cruel. That's when it crosses an ethical line for me. Other people don't necessarily have this. So that's something that I always keep in mind whenever I introduce anything that can be considered fantastical. I'm not perfect in this. I know that that there are presentations that I've fallen into that invoke things that I do not want to put in my spectators' minds without it being clearly in the context of the fiction of the performance. I don't want to imply that I'm actually tapping into something supernatural or ghosts, but I have less of a problem implying that my character within the context of a fiction is tapping into those things. So back to the premise of the SpongeBob routine. The clowns kind of do that to a degree for me. Not that I think that the SpongeBobs are inherently a routine that you have to worry about that kind of ethical line, but the topic of premises is something where you do have to worry about that. And that's also part of why I think I've kind of avoided anthropomorphizing, because there's a certain ridiculousness, childishness to it. So coming at it from more of a quirky side as opposed to a childish side, not that they can't overlap, is different for me. Contextualizing the SpongeBobs as the chopped off noses of actual clowns that I've killed is different than talking about how the card that I'm tearing is representative of a lady being sawn in half on stage. I don't do stage illusions, so here I'm going to saw this lady in half with my hands. I don't like the latter, but I'm not minding the former as much. And I'm sure you could come up with a similarly quirky premise for a torn restored card along those lines of doing the sawing in half. And I know people have done great versions with that exact premise of the close-up sawing in half. So premises are something that I've spent a lot of time struggling with. Similarly, another one that I'm tackling right now in this same act are premises for the cups and balls or the chopped cup. I've never liked talking about it being a game, particularly when it's not a game. Yes, there are roots of it being in a game, but most presentations, if they talk about it being a game, are not really being presented as a game. There may be a phase or two where you do say, give a person in the audience a chance to pick a cup, but that's really not the underlying premise of the routine that they're going with. And this is, again, one of those things where I've fallen into using premises that I do not like. It's not because of lack of a better option. It's for lack of a better effort. I've not put in the effort, despite the mileage I put into some of these routines performing, and restaurants are great for that. You get 30, 40 tables a night that you can practice a routine and hone it. So in one night, you can take a routine from here to here. Whereas, if you're just doing a single set once a night, then you're going to take your routine from here in one night, and then maybe it's here the next night, and then maybe it's here the next night. But restaurants, you've got so many tables, you can introduce a new premise that maybe even came to you because of something somebody said. You can introduce it on table 3, and by the time you get to table 27 that night, that premise has evolved into an entire routine, and now you've got a starting point for a script. And I emphasize that it's still just the starting point. You may feel like, oh, I've got my script now after a night's worth of honing this routine. Well, no, you've got a premise that you've stretched out. You really need to script that and refine it from there. And then the next night that you're performing, you will continue that process. But that doesn't mean that you should not be taking time with a pen and paper or notes in your phone and breaking down that script, and that you shouldn't be filming yourself. Film yourself doing it with all the crap that you say after that premise, and then watch it without the audio on. This is a great advice given to me by Jonah Badams. Rewatch it without audio and then start working out what you should be saying, because now you've created sort of this removal. You've removed yourself one step from the performance, so you're less in your head when you're watching it with the audio off. If you're watching just what you normally ramble on about with the audio on, you're very much going to be putting yourself in that head space. Whereas if you just turn that off, you can watch your routine a little bit more objectively, trying to remove yourself and watch so that you're saying, oh, well, this is what's happening here from the audience's perspective. This is what would make sense to say here. This is a way of saying that fits within the premise I'm already working with. And so from there, you can start reworking and retooling and rescripting and actively editing. I use Evernote on my phone, and I've got everything written out and scripted. When I start thinking of new premises or lines, then I will pull out my phone and I'll throw it in. What I often do is I then have a recording of just my voice doing my script. So as I go through listening, I'm going through the actions in my mind, and sometimes even with the props in hand. And then as I start to think of other lines or other moments that can be added, then I bring up my phone and I go into the Evernote and I edit the script. That way I can literally be reviewing the script as I'm editing it. So these are just a few of the hurdles that I've had to deal with so far with structuring an act and retooling things that I previously thought were fully fleshed out routines just because of all the years I'd put in doing them in the restaurants, and in some cases they were. But now in the context of a full act or a full show, I'm having to completely reevaluate and rescript, and even in some cases just restage routines that I've got built into my muscle memory. So it's constant work. Nothing is ever finished. No matter how much you think you've got something down, no matter how much you think, yeah, this is done, I can put a pin in it, I'm never going to be able to take this routine any further, it's in my back pocket, I can pull it out whenever I want, don't need to rework it. That's never true. You know, there's always things that will change, be it context, or you're going to use it in a different venue or different place, or reapply it now because you now realize that, oh, this routine you've done for 30 years can now lead into this new routine, but it recontextualizes how that initial routine has to end or how it has to be presented, because the premise of that routine now becomes a direct conflict of the premise of that secondary routine. And that's not to say that you can't have premises that seemingly contradict in your performances, but you have to make sure that they do not directly conflict within the overall structure. You need to find a way to make that make sense. So if I start with a premise like with the sponge balls, that I've chopped the noses off clowns, but then the clowns are still very mischievous, even their noses, and that's why the noses are misbehaving and jumping from hand to hand. But my very next routine is about how I have absolute control over these props, and I'm more about showing my power as a magician and my power over things. You've now got a conflict that when you put those back to back, especially. Even just having those in the same show, you seem to have a conflict, which is why you can't just put them back to back. You would need to create an arc there. Maybe you start as a magician who's dealing with props that are getting away from them, the Sorcerer's Apprentice type approach where you don't necessarily have the skill, but as the act goes, then, you know, you have a transition where you start to get control, and that can happen all within one routine. That can happen all within Sponge Balls, where, you know, they're getting away from me, but then by the end of the routine, no, I've got it in control. Whereas if you do what is actually more my approach, which is I don't get control, and then in the end, there's just this explosion of noses from, you know, kids' noses now that I can't, it's just too much. So for me to then immediately go into a routine which is more about my control does not work. So that's why if I do those routines back to back, I have to change and tweak the premises slightly to make them jive. Whereas if I open with the sponge balls and then move on to another routine that's more about control, towards the end of a set, I would need a transitional routine or routines, or like I said, just changing the ending of that sponge ball routine so that it then makes sense that I am now presenting something that is more about my control of the objects as opposed to the sponge balls, which is about my lack of control. That's just the first of some of my thoughts and some of the hurdles I'm facing developing this act. And hopefully I can take you guys along with me on this journey, and you guys can get a little bit of insight, a little bit of behind the scenes on developing character and scripting and working on an act. Not that I'm claiming to be an authority in any way, shape, or form here. This is more of a, you're following me as I learn a lot of these things as well. Because as much as I've put the time and hours into a lot of my pieces in the context of close-up performances, structuring an act is something that's new to me. So it's exciting, it's thrilling, I'm happy to share it with you guys, and I hope you guys are getting something out of this as well. Tune in, we'll see you next time.